Hello, and welcome back to Dungeon Master U, where you are the Dungeon Master. I'm DM Lee, and I'm here to tell you about your first session. What you will have to have prepared. What will it be like? That was a weird intro, wasn't it? Yeah, it was a little weird. That's okay. In this episode, we're going to go over the first session. In the last one, we talked about session 0, and some of the things that you needed to have prepared for your first session. In this one, we'll talk about your campaign and how to begin it, and the things that you may or may not want to do in order to start it off right. So I have this intro written here. I usually type up like a little paragraph to try and write it out, and I think this one's pretty cute, so I'm just going to read it to you word for word. Running your first game can be overwhelming. I mean, what happens if, or when, you don't knock your players' gosh darn brains out of their heads with all original content that rivals the epic scope of J.R.R. Tolkien's seminal masterpiece, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil? Why, spending an awesome evening with your friends, of course. Remember, the whole point is for you and your friends to spend an awesome evening together, having awesome adventures, exploring, and telling stories. And that's one of those things that you want to memorize and read word for word, and you try to improvise it, and it just doesn't come out right. But it's entirely true. One of the most important things when you're dungeon mastering your first game is to remember that it's you and your friends having fun. Now, there are a couple ways to start this off that can help you really engage with the campaign on your terms, without getting too bogged down in the details. What we're going to go over in this episode will hopefully start you off on the right foot. We'll go over an overview of what to expect on your first game and the social interactions that dungeon mastering can kind of bring up. We'll talk about how to start off your campaign right. What else will we talk about? Let me check my notes. And we'll go over the nitty-gritty structure of what your first session might look like. And as with many of the other episodes that I'm going to put out, this is less of a strict rule set and more of a guideline or an example of what seems to work for me. So, with that in mind, let us begin. So first off, I'm going to talk about what to expect in your first session. If you've never DM'd a game before, it can be pretty intimidating to try and sit down with a group of people you may or may not know, to inspire them to pretend to be other people, make believe an adventure, and interact with one another on a one-to-one basis. When DMing your first game, it's important to remember that tabletop RPGs are a lot different than many other media that we've consumed throughout our lifetimes. For example, in a single-player video game or a hero's journey type narrative like Star Wars, you have one main character. This main character is often the focus of the narrative, and all of the scenes tend to revolve around them. And while that's not a bad thing, that isn't necessarily what you're going for in your first session of Dungeons & Dragons. Instead, it helped me to think about DMing a game more like running Ocean's 11. What I mean to say is Dungeons & Dragons involves a cast of highly specialized main characters that each have something to contribute to the overall story. They may each have their individual arcs, but you're all sitting down at a table together to collaborate on one story. I have written down, DMing your first game isn't quite like herding cats, but more like getting a crew of people who are all their own main characters, all working together towards the same objective. A heist isn't going to be successful unless everybody gets to do their part. So that's the first thing. Each person is their own main character. And that's okay. Just let people do what they're gonna do. In your first session of Dungeons & Dragons, you will sit down and present a situation to your players. Then, what you will do is let them take over. You'll let them stretch their role-playing muscles and really get into it. Or not, honestly, as the case may be. The goal for your first session should be letting your players engage with the material how they want to engage, and offering some gentle encouragement to try and get them more into the situation. So, structurally, how's that gonna look? First step, let's establish how you're going to start off your campaign. Now, there are a whole bunch of different ways to begin a campaign, and none of them are any more valid than the others. What I'm going to present to you right now is kind of more of an introductory and base level engagement for your campaign, which is a great place to start. The question of how to begin an actual campaign is one that has plagued dungeon masters for over 50 years. Like, the hobby has only been going on for about 60 years, and at the beginning it was kind of just like, hey, you're in a dungeon, go fight. Everybody by now is probably familiar with the cliche of you all meet in a tavern. And honestly, that's a pretty good place to start any session of Dungeons and Dragons. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a tavern. You can also, as in the case of the Mines of Phandelver, be caravan guards escorting valuable cargo. Or you can all be hired to do the same job. The important thing is that you're starting off in a familiar setting. By meeting in a tavern or establishing the equivalent kind of cliche version of the beginning of a campaign, you are letting all of the players in at a familiar place. If you start your players off in a really unique way, then you run the risk of slapping them in the face with a lore dump. And while that's not a bad thing, if it's your first time dungeon mastering a session, then you can turn your players off by giving them a little too much to focus on and throwing them into this alien world that they're not familiar with. By meeting in a tavern or establishing another cliche setting for the beginning of your campaign, you cut out the middleman and let your players engage with it on their own terms. Remember, your players might be doing this for the first time, and by letting them establish their own characters in a familiar setting, it can really help the role-playing process along. Another common stumbling block for the beginning Dungeon Master is, how do all the players know each other? Short answer, it's totally okay to say they know each other because they've been on adventures together before. Having a simple established backstory like that allows your players to open up more to the possibility of filling out the details later on down the line. Say, after they know their characters better, or after they're more familiar with role-playing, or if they're more comfortable being in this assumed identity. By establishing that your players all know each other prior to the events of the first campaign, you allow your players a lot more leeway in how they express themselves without getting bogged down in the details of their own individual backstories. Now, again, you don't have to go with that exactly, but you want to keep in mind that the familiarity and the comfort is what's important in the first session. The fewer hoops you make your players jump through before you begin the game of Dungeons and Dragons, the better. And by that I mean to say, if you put the burden of creating this huge amount of story on the shoulders of your player, there's a chance they'll get overwhelmed. Instead, create that simple beginning entry point where you hire all of the players for the same job, and they're each specialists in their own field. Or you all meet in I lost my train of thought there. Get back together for one last job before retirement. You know, all of the standards. What you want to do is make it easy on your players. And, frankly, easy on yourself. If you'd like to integrate your character's backstory, a good way to get that going is to start asking your players questions about how they feel about the events, or how they might know other players, or to describe a story in which something happened. Like, say, player A and player B do know each other from a previous adventure, and something went wrong. Ask them to establish what went wrong between the two. There's no answer that's too silly, but try to keep it within the realm of possibility in the world that you've already established. That's actually one of my favorite introductions to a campaign I've ever had was a friend of mine that I had only known very briefly at the point. She had prepared a list of questions, and she had asked us to go through each one, and it was stuff like, on your last investigation, you discovered a disturbing connection. What was that connection? And this is kind of contrary to what I was saying, but it's a really fun way, especially with more experienced role players who are more comfortable with establishing in-world content, to get them to engage and build a history together. It's a really fun idea. So something to keep in mind on top of these easy entry points is asking your characters questions. Okay. So your players are all in the same place, whether it's a tavern or on the same caravan or getting together in a smoky basement for one last job. Likewise, your characters have a history, though it might not be filled in, which is totally okay right now. That's actually an important point. The benefit of having that established history is that your players don't have to get through that awkward phase where they're trying to find an excuse to work together. One of the things that I have noticed in the first sessions of almost any campaign that I've started for a very long time is that there's always like a question of whether or not these people would agree to go on a job together. By establishing that they already know each other or that they have some other reason to stick together beforehand, you cut that entire part out, which can be a lot more comfortable for first-time players and for a first-time dungeon master. So, okay, you have a place where all the players are gathered, whether it's a cavern, which is a caravan or a tavern. So, you have a place for all of your players to get together, whether it's a tavern or a caravan or a smoky basement, what have you. They're all in one place. You have a reason for them to be on the same team, which is important. The last piece of the starting off puzzle is the objective. As a first-time Dungeon Master, you might want to consider establishing an objective beforehand for all of your players to work towards. A lot of the time, your inclination might be trying to establish organically the objective for your players. By which I mean trying to walk them towards it, trying to establish that they're going out and finding this objective. I would recommend, if it's your first time DMing a session, you just establish that beforehand. You're all gathered in one place, you're all working together, and you're all working towards the same goal. You might want to keep that goal pretty simple, too, like some of the children of the village have gone missing, or there's a treasure at the bottom of a dungeon, but your players have to fight to get to it. Just something to get the players moving, and a reason for them all to work together towards the same goal. And that's pretty much it for this setup. You need a place for all the players to be, a reason for all the players to work together, and something for all the players to work together for. I have written down here, the goal of the start is to have everyone in the same place and aimed in the same direction. And that's pretty much true. After you establish that big 3 for the first session, it's nice to let the players kind of just flex their role-playing muscles and play around and interact in the world. Encourage them to ask questions and describe situations and give tantalizing clues and cool NPCs and all that stuff, and just let them play around in the sandbox you've created for a little bit. There are as many ways for a first session of Dungeons & Dragons to go as there are players of Dungeons & Dragons. Seriously, sometimes first sessions can go off the rails, and that's awesome. That is such a fun way to get your players engaged. Allowing them to participate with a game in the way that they choose to participate is one of the big draws of tabletop RPGs. That being said, as a general milestone, I like to include in my first session a first encounter. Now, the purpose of this first encounter is to be something of a tutorial for your players, and for yourself. It might not be super story relevant, and it might not be super challenging, but it's a good way for everybody to get the rules of combat well in hand. The first encounter that I typically plan is something like this. So your characters are walking down a road towards their objective, whatever it happens to be. On the way, they are waylaid by 5 bandits. 3 armed with melee weapons, and 2 armed with ranged weapons. The 3 bandits with the melee weapons charge forward. The 2 with the ranged weapons hang back and shoot. That's it. The idea behind this encounter is to introduce to your players the idea of tactics, and to give them a chance to become familiar with the ways in which their particular character class excels. For example, if you have a fighter, they're gonna have a fun time whacking at the 3 swordsmen coming at them. On the other hand, if you have a ranged spellcaster, they'll figure out pretty quickly that something that they can do is shoot the bowman. Always keep in mind, however, that first level Dungeons & Dragons characters are very fragile. You don't often come to your good abilities until level 3, and the number of hit points that a character has at the very beginning is negligible. Like, 2 good hits and you go down. That's why I don't mess around with any complicated abilities or any weird situational environmental effects, just 5 bandits on a road, with a little bit of tactical complication. If it seems like the players are losing, that's okay. This is a great opportunity to give the bandits a chance to just, steal their shoes and run away. Seriously, one of the best ways to motivate a player in Dungeons & Dragons is steal something from them. I have never seen a more motivating hook. And if they're distracted by the bandits, maybe it gives you a chance to just improvise a little bandit hideout, a nice little side plot, But, hopefully, if all goes as planned, then you reach the dungeon intact. This is a great moment in any campaign, reaching the front door of the dungeon. It's like you've gotten through all the introductory tutorial combat, and then the world opens up to you. And I don't mean the front door of the dungeon necessarily in a literal sense. It can be the introduction of whatever story hook you're going into. Say, for example, this is where you introduce the villain with the 1 iron eye and a scrawl of scars across their face. Or you see the crypt door ajar and there's humming coming out of it. Whatever the front door of the dungeon happens to be, this is where the players take the wheel and tell you what they're interested in. This is the beginning of the truly fun part of Dungeons and Dragons, especially if you're a dungeon master. Your job at this point is to make whatever your players find interesting, fun, and engaging. It's here where, even if your players are chasing down that bandit that stole their shoes, that you make it... What I have written here is, make it as interesting as the players seem to think it is. I think that's a really good way of putting it, is no matter whether or not you have this giant plot arc planned out, let your players engage with your game as they see fit. After all, as the Dungeon Master, it's your job to let players do what they want. Give them a bunch of breadcrumbs, and if they choose not to follow them, then that's fine. I mean, the players might just chase down the bandits that stole their shoes. And that's awesome! The most important thing at this point is to give whichever trail your players follow a payoff. Whether that's a fun story hook, or a challenging encounter, or a good treasure, or just experience points. At this point, you should be ready to answer any of the questions that your players may have, whether that's related to the game, such as, like, what's behind this door, or whether that's related to the world, such as, what would my character think about necromancy? You don't have to have an encyclopedic reference for all of these answers, but you do have to be ready to answer them on the fly. If you're a new dungeon master, this might be a good time to reference some pre-written material. There are a whole bunch of different adventures that Wizards of the Coast and others have written that are amazing, and they're really detailed and really fun to play. For example, some of my favorite gaming moments in the recent years have been with the Curse of Strahd book. I can't recommend that enough. It's awesome. If you feel like making up the details of the world could be a little too intimidating, I can definitely recommend pre-written material. Wizards of the Coast and other writers have come up with incredible adventures for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. This comes with the warning, of course, that sticking too closely to pre-written material can lend your campaign a sense of being on rails and being a little too strict, which limits player engagement. Always be ready and excited to improvise material. Okay, by now you're probably in a good place in your first session, and you might even be leading into the second. The goal behind all of this stuff in this video is to give you enough inertia to keep the game going for a third and a fourth and however many you end up doing. There are a couple of things to keep in mind to keep that energy going and to keep the inertia of your game intact. First of all, your players will help you if you let them. One of the most important things that I have ever learned as a dungeon master is yes and. If a player has asked you if they can do something, say, yeah, give it a try. Your job is to enable your players to do what they want. If they want to follow a path, make sure that it's possible in some way. And if they choose to follow a path, make sure there's something at the end of it. Remember, you're telling a story together. You're creating an adventure. That's all you have to do. Alright, I promise, we're in the home stretch. The last gameplay element I'm gonna take some water. Take a hit of that water. That's a good water. Alright, we're in the home stretch. The last gameplay element that I wanted to introduce in this video is giving your players a door into role-playing. The reason this is at the end of the checklist is that there's no set time this should come in during your first session. It's more of a catch-as-catch-can, feel it out, and see when the right time to introduce these elements is. Sort of thing. I realized that sentence kind of got away from me. What I mean is this. Any chance you can give your players to decide something about their character is good. For example, there are only a few dishes at the tavern, and most of them are based on seafood. Does your character like seafood? How does your character feel about the person giving them the job? Right down to what color is your character's jacket? All of these questions are designed to give your character a chance to figure something out about themselves, and to establish more fully a picture of their character in your players' minds. One of my favorites that I use in almost every game that I run is how does your character's spell manifest? Like, say for example they cast Mage Hand. What does your Mage Hand look like? Specifically, what does your character's Mage Hand look like? Is it different than every other Mage Hand out there? The first session is a great place to establish the practice of asking your players questions about the characters. And just surface level stuff. What does something look like? What does this remind you of? How do you feel about this? If you're playing with new players, Asking these questions can really help establish the idea of being in a different identity. Whether or not they want to pretend to be this person is kind of irrelevant at this point. Rather, getting in the practice of asking these questions and establishing these small role-playing moments gives your players the chance to practice role-playing before they really get into it. This can really pay off later on down the line in maybe your 10th or 15th session where you remember this character detail that they established all the way back at the beginning, and it really helps them feel like a different person. And that's pretty much it. That's what to do in your first session if you're not sure where to start. Remember, the goal is to have fun. No matter what happens, let your players do what they want and encourage it. Have a good time. At this point, the biggest question you want to ask yourself is, did the players have fun? If they did, awesome, you did your job. If they didn't, if there was a moment where things seemed to bog down or people seemed bored or upset, don't beat yourself up. That's okay. It's a great moment to sit back and analyze the situation and see what you could improve on. Always feel free to ask your players questions. Did you like this? Did you not like this? Why? Gather information and see what felt good. See what flowed and what engaged the players. See what didn't and see what you could do to change it. Don't expect your first session of Dungeons & Dragons to go flawlessly. It won't. I still run campaigns 20 years into this hobby and flub it immensely. What's important is that you and your friends get together to collaborate to tell a cool story. And that's it. That's my advice for your session 1. I hope you have a good time, and tell me about your session in the comments. I'd love to hear it. In the next episode of Dungeon Master U, we're going to go over some of the techniques that I have found really valuable when getting into role-playing. This includes improvisation techniques and detail techniques and all of that sort of thing that can really help you get the game that you see in your head out into the world. And take your DM skills to the next level. Do you like my guitar solo? I used to write freelance articles for marketing, and you have to really lean on those, like, attention-grabbing headlines. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you really enjoyed. Tell me if you have any questions or anything you'd like me to cover in further detail down below. Subscribe if you want. I don't know. I'm having a good time. Hope I see you next time. Hope I see you next time. Game on. I'm gonna have like a B-reel of all of my outros on this. I don't have a good conclusion yet. I'm kind of like making this up as I go along. So, roll them bones. 2 craps. Okay, bye.